I always advise against it, because if you memorise it, even if you then use a checklist, you're more likely to skip things on the checklist. So when you don't memorise it and you use a checklist every time, you have to stick to the checklist. So there's no chance of you missing anything on the checklist. Okay, I think I'm looking at starting. This is a Sling 2. This is a carburetted version engine, which means that we use a carburettor, which is like an old-fashioned type of piece of hardware that mixes the fuel and air together before it goes into the cylinders. Unlike an injected engine, which uses electric injectors to inject that fuel-air mixture into the cylinders. So a couple of things we need to do before we start. Obviously, make sure that when we start, we haven't got anyone around near the propeller. We're a good distance away from any aircraft, particularly behind us when we get the prop blast starting behind us. So there's no aircraft directly behind us. If, for instance, we started up and we were to launch forward a bit, there's plenty of room, manoeuvring room in front of us, so we're not going to hit anything. So we make sure our brake is on, which it is. Before we start now, and obviously we want to run through the checklist. We're going to run through that right now. So for the Sling, this is Sling 7788. Our seat position is checked. We've already checked that in the pre-flight, but it is secure. Fuel caps, we're looking to the right and left. They're both on. Documents and covers, we know they're all on board. We've checked those before. Headsets are plugged in and working, which they are. Pre-start checks. Our pre-flight inspection has been completed. Passenger brief, we've got no passengers today, but if you had a passenger, you'd want to brief them on what you're doing. You'd also brief them on any emergency procedures involved. Hatches and harnesses, my seatbelt is secure, but I will check that again. Loose articles are all secure in the cabin. Our circuit breakers here are all in. Now if they were out, they'd be out about 4mm on this aircraft, but they're all in. Fuel selector valve, we're going to move to the emptiest tank for startup, and then we move to the fullest tank for takeoff. We want to be able to test both tanks before we take off that they're both working. Parking brake, we've just checked, so we double check that again. So this is a handbrake, this aircraft, so we move the handbrake back, and then we lock the locking pin in place, which we have. And master switch is on, which is there, which is already on. Our EFIS, which is here, and our EFIS battery backup is on. Very important that with an electronic flight instrumentation system, we have a Garmin G3X here, that we have that up and running before we start the engine. I don't have any engine instrumentation here displaying until this is live. We don't want to start the engine and worst case scenario, you have no oil pressure and not be aware of that and have that engine running for a while. So make sure this is up and running. We hit continue on this one once it's up and running, which it is. Great, if it's up, fuel pump, which is our backup electric fuel pump, is on. Battery backup we've already put on there. And engine's a bit cold, so on some carburetor engines we have what we call a choke, and we want to just pull that out. First flight, engine being a bit cold, set a little bit of throttle. We want to make sure that no one is around the propeller area before we begin, and we always yell out clear prop before we start the engine. So I'm looking around, all good, we know our brakes there. Other thing to keep in mind is that if, for instance, that we launched forward when we started and the brakes weren't working, we want to be ready to shut the engine down as well, which would be a quick off here on the keys ignition. So choke keys pull back, looking around, set the throttle a few millimeters, looking around and clear prop, turn key to start, and once started, it's back to both, and then we can let the choke back in as we keep the RPM around 2,000 RPM.
Lambda traffic, Delta Link.
After start, we're looking at our RPM at around 2,000 RPM here. Oil pressure, which is just here, make sure it's in the green. We want to make sure there's oil pressure straight away, otherwise we'd have to shut down. It's in the green, that's fine. Oil temperature is still cold, that's why it's flashing. Avionics, our volts have to be above about 12.5 volts on this aircraft, but we can see it here at 13 volts. With the Rotax engines, once the RPM's at 2,500 RPM for a few seconds, it should jump up to about 13.2, which it does, and that simply means the alternator is working.
Would
Good. We've got volts. Our transponder is on. This is automatic 1200 transponder on this one, which is good. Radio is on 12585, which is Calandra CTAF. And standby is 1290. Which is good. And switches that are required to be on are strobe and nav. And some aircraft like to put the strobe on before they start up. It depends on the aircraft type. And when it's cleared to do so, we're going to move to an area away from other aircraft to do our engine run-ups. So I'm going to make sure you have your hand on the brake ready, turn the locking pin off. And for the Sling aircraft, looking around. Sure we're clear of other aircraft. And we're going to move to the run-up area, which is an area that's clear of any aircraft. It's also very important that when we're taxiing, we test our brakes and to make sure that we're getting full deflection on our rudders and they're working properly. Which we can see they're working.
Calandra traffic, Delta Lima, turning base, runway 12, full stop, Calandra.
Okay, we're going to taxi aircraft into wind. And set our brake with the locking pin on. And do our engine run-ups. So we want to then now move our fuel tank to the fuelless tank, which is the right-hand tank. So in the Sling aircraft we have left and right.
Runway.
Left and right. Before we do that though, we're just going to run through some basic cockpit familiarisation of what everything is. So here we have the Garmin, what we call the G3X, which is what's called an EFIS or electronic flight instrumentation system. On the left-hand side of this aircraft we have manifold pressure, we have engine RPM, we have how many litres per hour we're using, we have oil pressure, oil temperature, water temperature, fuel quantity, both left and right, and volts, how much volts the alternator is producing. We also have here our airspeed indicator. Move straight across here, we've got our artificial rise where that line is. We have our altimeter here. And beside that is like a little black arrow, and that's our vertical speed indicator. Barometric pressure here, and we have our heading here, which is directional gyro below. We also have on this Garmin our trim and flap indicator here as well. It's a touch screen. We can get more information by hitting this left-hand bar. We're not going to run through that today in a lot of detail. We'll just go back to the main page. Over here we have our analog backup instruments. We have our airspeed indicator, a slip indicator, altimeter, radio on top. We have a selection of switches. Up is on in the Sling aircraft. We have our choke, our flap indicator, our key start, ignition, and our master switch. Our charge light, if that was on, it would mean our battery's not charging. Then it could be a problem with the alternator. Fuel selector valve, which is both left, right, and off. Park brake here. Throttle. And locking pin. Keep in mind this is a carburetted Rotax engine, not a fuel-injected type. And obviously we also have our circuit breakers over here and our iPad, which we use for navigation, which we won't be looking at today. Once again, we're about to look at our engine run-ups. Make sure there's no aircraft behind you and there's no one around you before you do and you're into wind if possible. So before we can do our engine run-ups, make sure that our temperatures are in the green. We don't want the engine too cold when we run the engine up, and they're all in the green at the moment, so we can start that. So once again, go back to your checklist. Engine run-up, fuel selector valve to the fullest tank, which we have. Temperatures and pressures are all in the green. Parking brake is set. RPM, we're going to set 3,500 RPM. About 10 seconds.
Calandra traffic.
And then we're going to check out left and right on the ignition key. So we're going to go left. There should be a drop, no more than about 200. Back to both. And then to right. Once again, a drop, no more than about 200. If it's sounding really rough, it could be a problem. What we're doing here, we're checking each cylinder has 2 spark plugs. And they're both independent of each other electrically. So we're checking that left and right spark plugs in each cylinder runs independently of each other. So if we went to left, for instance, and there was a problem, we with one of the spark plugs, it would be running really rough, and it'd be a sign to shut down and go and get an engineer to have a look at the spark plugs. That's fine. It's running great. So back to both. Our ignition we've checked. Fuel pump. We just turn this is an electric backup fuel pump. We normally have a mechanical pump that works all the time, but our backup electrical one is there also. But we want to turn that off to make sure it is working. The mechanical one's just working on its own, which it is. We put the fuel pump back on, and we keep that on for circuit work or on takeoff. And above 1,000 feet, we can turn that off. Okay, once we've done all that, when we check all the temperatures and pressures are all in the green, we can then look at bringing our RPM back to idle. And what we're looking at here is that it's idling okay, and we're still getting enough voltage here, even at lower RPM. We can see the volt says 13.2, so we can see there that we've got enough voltage above 12.5. We've got no charge light coming on, which means there's still enough charge to charge the battery, and we're not discharging power from the battery. Happy with that, we can bring it back to 2,000 RPM. Okay, we then do our controls, pre-takeoff checks on the checklist, our controls. So we want to make sure we've got full and free sense of movement on the controls. There's nothing in the cockpit that's impeding our full deflection on our controls. And we're also looking outside on the cockpit too. So when the control comes to the right aileron goes up, left goes down. With the control comes to the left aileron goes up and right goes down. And we can see the elevator is moving as well freely, which it is. Trim. We're checking our trim. It's hard as it would be impossible to see a trim from the cockpit, so we can look at our trim indicator. So I'm going trim up and trim down. I can see that the trim indicator is moving, and we bring it back to the neutral position, which is halfway. Fuel contents, we can see here left and right. We can get a bit more detail if we touch the touch screen. We can see the fuel quantity here. But I've also done a fuel dip. We know we've got more than 2/3 in both tanks. We've got plenty of fuel on board. Fuel selector valve, once again to the fourth tank, which is the right tank, which we've done. Instruments, we check left to right. So it's all looking good. We can put our heading bug before we take off. Today it'll be 1-2. We can put that onto 1-2. Taking off, which is there. Our altimeter, we can check. We simply set our field elevation for a local flight today, which is 40 feet, and make sure our backup altimeter is set for 40 feet as well. And once again, we're charging above 12.5 volts. Lights, we're going to put our strobe and nav on. If it was a busy day or an airport or it was low visibility, you might want to put your taxi and landing light on as well. The final items to check are our flap. We want to check our flap goes full down, so we go full down, and we're checking left and right that our flaps are coming down evenly. Once they're down, go back up to up, make sure they do retract fully, and then for 1 for takeoff. Our ignition switch is on to both. Our backup electric fuel pump is on, which we have for takeoff or circuit. To make sure our hatches and harnesses are all secure, seatbelt nice and secure, and if you had a passenger you'd make sure that was secure, and the canopy is locked. Make sure that is around the locking nut and locked and secure. And it's your first flight of the day, you might want to do a radio check as well. So just be simple as make sure you're on the correct frequency and backup frequency, and just giving a call, an all station call. So to be simple as Line traffic Sling 7788 requesting radio check. And it's very quiet today, but if there were other aircraft in the circuit, they would...
55 Hotel Kilo has the Sling 5x5.
There we go. Okay, so we've got an aircraft there, just told us second reading is 5, which is the best you can get as far as radio. If they were telling you it was like 3 or below, you might want to get that checked out. So we know the radio is working, we're on the correct frequency. We can now give our taxi call for our preferred runway and go flying. important that while we're taxiing to the runway and if we're holding for a while, do another check. You've already done your checks, but just sit and do a check left to right.
500, tracking from off ahead. Caboose.
We're going to look at our shutdown check, so we'll make sure the brakes are on. And once again, go to your checklist. Shutdown checks, brakes set, RPM set 2000 RPM, which we have. Check out temperatures and pressures are all on the green, which they are. Trim, we'll make sure the trim is set back to the neutral position. Flaps, make sure the flaps are retracted to 0. Avionics, we normally turn those off, but because we're talking on the video, I'm going to keep them on. Fuel pump. We actually turn the fuel pump off. It's like another check to make sure that it is working with the manual pump. And this, we turn the lights off as well. RPM back to idle. And then ignition off. And we stop. This would be the point 2 that we quickly check our hobs time. Hit the button there, it's down here, total hours, and write that down on our flight log or maintenance release. We've done that, we're happy with that. All switches off, and our masters off. Okay, welcome to GoFly Online, and we're now going to be looking at the cockpit familiarisation and the pre-start, after-start and engine run-up and pre-takeoff checks on the injected model for the Rotax Sling aircraft. So a couple of the main differences obviously with the injected model is we use electric injectors and not a carburettor to supply the fuel-air mixture into the engine. And we can see that on here we have a fuel pump 1 and fuel pump 2, so we have a backup fuel pump, so 2 independent pumps that for the injectors. Now obviously they're electric, so they need to be on at all times. Other thing, a few little differences. We don't really, while we have a start key, we don't really have a left and right ignition key in the injected engine. We have a lane A and lane B. Think of those as independent electrical systems for our aircraft, and we'll talk a bit more about those after we start. So let's look at our basic startup. So we've done our pre-flight seat position. We should have checked before we got in. When it's fine, it's locked. Always double check your seat is locked. Fuel caps both right and left are on. Documents and covers are all on board. Headsets are plugged in correctly. We also want to make sure before we start that we're not going to start up with any aircraft around us. No one behind us, no aircraft behind us. We're going to blow a lot of air onto when we start the propeller, and it's just about being courteous, and if we can, try and start into wind if possible. Pre-flight inspection done, looking at the pre-start checklist now. Passenger brief completed, hatches and harnesses are secure, loose articles secure in the cockpit, circuit breakers are all in, and once again, if they were out, they'd be out about 5 millimetres. Fuel selector valve, we're going to go to the emptiest tank. Roger traffic, the left-hand side.
Put descending on the dead side to join midfield.
And left-hand side. And park selector traffic, light wing
4230 is now 5 miles to
1000 tracking.
to join downwind runway 12.
So our make sure our park brakes is coming.
Class there, Foxtrot India Quebec 4 miles to the west, inbound.
Okay. Try that again. Okay, welcome to GoFly Online. We're going to be looking at the cockpit familiarisation and our pre-start, after-start, engine run-up and pre-takeoff checks on the injected Rotax engine for our Sling aircraft. Now the main difference obviously with the injected model, we have electric injectors that inject the fuel into the cylinders and not a carburettor like on the other aircraft. So Good news is we don't usually get carburettor ice or some other issues that we have with carburetors. Very much like modern day cars, we use injectors, and here on the Sling we have fuel pump 1 and fuel pump 2, and they're independent fuel pumps for our injected engine. Other major difference is we don't really have a proper ignition key. We do have a start key. We don't have sort of a left and right ignition. We have what we call lane A and lane B. Think of lane A, lane B as independent electrical system for your aircraft type. Okay, we've looked at those differences. We're going to do the start up now. So seat position is checked. We have made sure it's locked in the correct position. Fuel caps both on, left and right. Documents are all on board. Our headsets are plugged in correctly. Our pre-start checklist now, pre-flight inspection has been completed. Passenger brief, obviously we do that if we had a passenger. Hatches and harnesses are secure. Loose articles secure. Circuit breakers are set in. If they were out, they'd be popping out about 5 millimeters. Fuel selector valve on the left tank, which is our lowest tank. We always start on the lowest tank, and we change to the fullest tank before takeoff. Parking brake, we simply pull the handbrake back like such, and the locking mechanism to on. Very important we don't actually put pressure on that while it's on. If you had to reset the brake, you turn that to off, reset the brake, then back to on again. Some of our Slings also do have toe brakes instead of a handbrake, but these aircraft have the handbrake. Okay, so our parking brake on, master switch is on here. EFIS, we're going to turn our EFIS on, and EFIS back up on. Make sure once again that our electronic flight instrumentation system is on. We want to be able to see the temperatures and pressures after we start. Our fuel pumps, like I said before, our electric fuel pumps, when they need to be both on. Our lane A, lane B both have to be on as well. And our battery backup needs to be on for startup. Turn that on. That throttle, once again we look around for starting, make sure there's no one around in the propeller area, and we yell out, clear prop, and T to start. And engine started nicely. And after start, RPM 2000. And we're looking for the oil pressure straight away from the checklist. And our oil pressure here is in the green, which we can see, which is good. It means we can keep continuing. If it was reading 0, we'd want to shut the engine down straight away. Like the other aircraft, want to make sure that our voltage is charging. We have our alternators, and we can see there that we've got both 14 volts showing on both. So if it was below 12 volts, we'd want to shut down. Or if this voltage started dropping over time, we'd want to land straight away as well. We can see our amps here. We're showing a positive amperage, which means our alternator is actually charging the battery. Okay, so we've checked the battery. Our voltage is fine. Avionics, we've turned on. Just here, yep. Lane A, lane B master warning. Now with the lane A, lane B, we've got 2 lights, one above lane A, one in lane B. Now if one of these lights were on, we'd want to shut down and start again. Now what these are, they're master warning lights. They're an indicator that there's something wrong with either our electrical system or something wrong with the engine. Secondary, you'd have a look here on the screen, and that will often show you that if there is something wrong. For instance, we might not have enough voltage charging. This might show up here, and you'd have a close look down here to see, hey, we've got no voltage. We've got a problem with our electrical system, and you want to shut down and get that checked out by a layman. But at the moment, both lights are off, which is great. Our transponder on this aircraft is here, and we have that onto standby on the ground. Before takeoff, we put it onto out and make sure it's on 1200 for VFR, flying outside of controlled airspace. Our radio is on. Yep. Our normal frequency is 12585 for Caloundra, but we've just got to set on a different frequency right now because it's quite busy, so we can talk. And we'll switch that before we take off. Switches as required. Like I said before, we can actually put our strobe and nav on. Some aircraft, it's good to put the strobe on before you start up as an indicator. Because of our small batteries on the Sling, we don't like to use too much battery power before we start up, so we put that on afterwards. And all required. Okay. fuel selector valve now onto the fullest tank. Actually, we'll move first. So once again, we want to move to the run-up area, which is an area that hasn't got aircraft around you, in a sort of a cleared area. So we're going to taxi that area now. Depending on the aerodrome you are at, you might need to give a taxi call, but here at Caloundra, because I'm not using any sort of one-way taxiways, I don't need to give a call to my run-up area. And at this point, we'll be checking the brakes work on our handbrake, and just check that rudders work, full deflection if we can. Yep, and they're working fine. Always do the engine run-ups into wind if you can. The wind's coming from this direction now, looking at the windsock. Gonna move across into wind there. And make sure our park brake is on. Now fuel selector valve now onto the fullest tank, which is our right tank. And this way we're testing both tanks before takeoff. Yep. So we're doing our engine run-ups now. Our fuel selector valve is on the fourth tank. Our temperatures and pressures, got to make sure that our T's and P's or temperatures and pressures are in the green before we can do the engine run-ups, which they are on the green. We don't want to be going to a high power setting at a low temperature. Now it depends on your screen. So this is an MGL screen, it's not a Garmin like the other aircraft. So we've got a fuel calculation there, it's flashing. We can just simply hit the menu button, and we have the fuel level calculated, which is there, which is number 6. And we can set how much fuel we got on board, and we've got 60 litres a side. So we're going to go across there, 30 litres a side, 60 litres in total. So we got 60, and then enter. And there we go. And that actually records it and counts down the amount of litres in that setting I just put in there from our fuel flow. It's like an extra check to make sure we've got enough fuel on board. So we can see it's not flashing now. So it's registered we've got enough fuel on board. So going back to our engine run-ups, temperatures and pressures are all in the green. Parking brake is set. RPM we simply set 3,500. Very similar to the Carby engine for 10 seconds. However, we don't test left and right spark plugs with our ignition switch. We have a lane A, lane B. We don't need to touch those, because if there was an issue with our electrical system, one of these lights would come on. What we do need to check from the checklist though is our fuel pumps, that they're independent of each other. So we check our fuel pump 1, we turn that off, make sure the engine is still running, back to on, and fuel pump 2, turn that off, make sure the engine is still running, and back to both. Now we know that both fuel pumps are running independent of each other. We've got no lane A, lane B. Temperature and pressures are all in the green. We can see also our voltage is looking good as well. Then we bring the throttle back to idle. Once again, making sure that the aircraft is idling successfully, which it is. The engine's not stopping. It should be around 1500 to 1600 RPM, which it is, which is good. And checking the voltage is still good, which it is at 14 volts. We go back to 2000. And the other check we do then is battery backup off, and we're just checking there's no major voltage change, which there isn't. Now the battery backup needs to be off when we're flying. We have it on for startup, and we turn it off as a part of our check before we take off. Now the battery backup is there if the alternator fails, or if we get if a dual alternator, failure, this is meant to be put to on, and that will send an electrical charge from the battery direct to our main system straight away. So once again, battery backup is on for startup, but for takeoff and flying in the air, we have it turned off unless we have an electrical problem with the alternator or the engine stops. Then you need to switch it on. Once we've done that, we've got our RPM back to 2000. Our controls, once again, full and free sense of movement. Make sure the controls aren't interfering with anything in the cabin. They aren't. We're also checking they move in the correct sense. So when we move the control column to the right, right aileron goes up. and move the control column to the left. Left aileron goes up, and elevator is moving freely as well, which it is. Fuel contents, we've checked the left and right, we've got fuel contents here, we've got plenty in there, which is great. Fuel selector valve, yep, we have that on the force tank. Trim, our trim indicator on this one's up here, and we're checking nose up and nose down trim is working, and we put it to the neutral position. Instruments, we check everything's in the green, which it is. Our battery is charging. Our altimeter here, we can set that on here. Little arrows, make sure it's set at 40 feet, which is airfield elevation here at Caloundra. There we go. And our manual is set. Yep, lights as required. We're going to have our strobe nav on, which is here. If it was a lot of traffic or low visibility, you might want to put the landing light and taxi on as well. Our flaps, we check. This one has a button flap lever, so we hit the number 3, the light should come on, and the flaps should come down. So we're checking those flaps left and right, which they're coming down. Back up to up, make sure they come up, and then 1 for takeoff, which is set. Hatches and harnesses are all secure. I'm secure, and our canopy is secure. Our transponder we could set now if we wanted to. Was near the runway to out. With the injected model once again, a couple of differences. So we've obviously got our EFA screen. The EFA on the MGL is very similar to the Garmin. We have our airspeed indicator, altimeter. Our vertical speed indicator is down here, just below. Trim indicator, fuel and engine all on the bottom. Everything else is very similar. We've got a radio, analog instruments, slip indicator, switches, transponder, which I'll put to out. And this is all the same as far as left and right tank. Our circuit breakers are all the same. We want to make sure we're on the correct frequency. And 12585 for Caloundra. And once again, if it's the first flight of the day, or it's quiet, you might want to do a radio check. I'll do a quick radio check now. Caloundra traffic, Sling 1675, radio check, 12585. Yeah, reading your 5. Okay. 1675, thank you. So there we can see the radio is working. Reading is 5 on the correct frequency. Double traffic. We've done 2 kilos through the runway. We've done all our checks, and then we can do our radio call for the preferred runway and go flying. Take a look at our shutdown checks for the injected model. So part brake is set and it's on. RPM set 2000 RPM. There's temperature and pressures. We're getting a little bit hot in the coolant while we're taxiing there, but still in the yellow, that's fine. Yep, trim is set for neutral. Make sure the trim is set back for neutral, which it is. Flaps, we put up. Make sure they come up. Yep. Avionics, would normally turn that off, but I'm still talking at the moment. Avionics, yep. Transponder, we to the off position. Lights off. Strobe and nav. And we'd throttle back to idle. And for the injected model, level is throttle back to idle, and we Both fingers on the fuel pump 1 and 2, and both fingers on the lane A, lane B, and both off at the same time. Like such. Pretty straightforward. We then get down the hob time on our EFIS, which is here. Write that down. Then we'd switch everything off, and obviously key off, and take the keys out and put them in the book. Thanks for joining us on GoFly Online.